It's funny because you sound pretty pessimistic and you're still much more optimistic than I am about what a Kamala Harris presidency would look like for Israel. I think that should she be elected, Israel is in for a world of pain. Her closing argument is no longer joy, turning the page. It's now this guy is a Nazi. I think that makes me feel a lot better about Trump's chances.
Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week, we have an important conversation about next week's presidential election, as well as Israel's ongoing war on Islamist terror in the Middle East, with Karol Markowicz, one of our most articulate political columnists and podcasters today. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. Also, one programming note. Next week, we're going to be going live on Thursday, November 7th, to break down the election results with my friend and JNS colleague Ruthie Bloom. That's going to be a must-watch show. And now to today's program. Are Americans, or approximately half of them, about to have a collective nervous breakdown? Increasingly, that seems to be likely. With Vice President Kamala Harris's closing argument for her presidential candidacy seeming to revolve around the charge that her opponent, former President Donald Trump, is a fascist, if not the second coming of Hitler, we are heading not just for a huge problem if, as the direction of the polls seems to be pointing, he wins. It sets up a situation in which an election is transformed from a choice between two individuals seeking the presidency to an existential struggle in which the two sides are not only unlikely to compromise or accept the prospect of defeat and their political foes taking power, but are essentially unable to do so. To lament such a framing of an election is not necessarily to absolve Trump for all of his flaws or to write off Harris, but the promiscuous use of Hitler and Nazi analogies in this election by his opponents is problematic because it is antithetical to how democracy, which Harris claims to be defending, must work. Much like the left's toxic woke ideology of critical race theory and the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, which calls for a perpetual race war between white oppressors, a category which includes Jews and Israelis, and people of color who are always victims, the notion of an election choice between democracy and fascism is one in which similarly ensures that neither side will accept defeat or be willing to play the role of loyal opposition. It ought to go without saying that such false Holocaust analogies cheapen the memory of the Shoah and reduce history to a hyperbolic partisan talking point. That it smacks of desperation also goes without saying, but that begs the question of how Americans will cope with a situation in which every election is followed by efforts to delegitimize and sabotage the winner. Though Trump didn't govern as an authoritarian, and despite the madness of January 6th, did leave office when he lost his bid for re-election 4 years ago, creating the expectation that him winning this time will end democracy and set up a Trumpist dictatorship is a prescription for chaos and violence if he prevails in the election. And it will further embitter Republicans if he does lose, which will also undermine democracy if his largely working-class followers are again treated as deplorables by the credentialed elites who now dominate the Democratic Party. Part and parcel of this dismal process of polarization is the collapse of journalism, as the corporate mainstream liberal media seems to think its job is not to report about the election, but to do everything in its power to defeat Trump by fair means or foul. Again, you can oppose Trump if you like, but if the press has decided its job is political activism rather than journalism, it can't play the role we need it to play to hold all those in power accountable. The real problem is when that is how an election is framed, we stop talking about policy, whether about the economy or illegal immigration and its impact on working class people, foreign policy, how DEI is ruining the country, or about the way that many Americans, particularly on the left, have embraced the Islamist war on Israel in such a way as to set off an unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism since October 7th. To discuss all this, the state of the presidential race, as well as its potential impact on Israel and the fight against anti-Semitism, I'm very pleased to have back with us today one of the smartest people writing about politics and policy. Karol Markowicz is a columnist at the New York Post and Fox News and co-author of the best-selling book Stolen Youth. She is host of The Karol Markowicz Show and co-host of Normally, both podcasts on iHeartRadio. Her Substack is karolmarkowicz.substack.com. Karol was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in Brooklyn. She now lives in South Florida with her husband and 3 children. Karol Markowicz, welcome back to Think Twice.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking not about the election, we will get to that and much else, but about the current state of American journalism and how it's influencing the election. At a time when the mainstream corporate media seems, with a few exceptions, determined to do everything to act as partisans rather than reporters, and to frame the election as a choice between democracy and fascism, and not to take the blame if Trump wins again, how does that actually damage democracy in ways that Trump posts on social media or bad jokes at political rallies don't?
Well, there's good news and bad news, and there's sort of the same thing, which is the mainstream media is in a steep, steep decline. I don't think they matter nearly as much as they did even, say, 10 years ago. I think that the last decade has really opened eyes and also just changed the media landscape. Look at the conversations going on around right now. It's not New York Times interviews that people are sitting down with, not even Kamala Harris. It's about maybe getting on Joe Rogan or on the Call Her Daddy podcast. It really has been the podcast election. And so I think we've seen a real shift in where people get their news and what matters to the candidates. So I don't think it makes a difference anymore what the mainstream media pushes. For example, we're in the last few days before the election, and both Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson have posted that the New York Times has reached out to them, basically threatening their YouTube money and saying that, can you confirm this Media Matters, which is a far, far left organization, saying that you've been saying that the election was stolen in 2020, and do you get paid by YouTube? So
I think it's interesting that they are attacking Tucker Carlson over this and not about platforming Holocaust denial, but that's a separate conversation.
Well, that's it, right? So they are trying to get them to not make money off from YouTube and really trying to hurt them in this last kind of run up to the election. But what ends up happening is both Tucker and Ben have these giant platforms where they're able to kind of cut them off and say, look what the New York Times is doing. I don't think we had that kind of reaction before. It used to be the New York Times could do whatever they want and everybody would just have to take it, and now they don't.
Yeah, that's very true. The corporate media is much less influential. Indeed, I think outside of the people who are sort of what we used to call, sort of inside, who are interested in sort of inside baseball, about the media and about politics, nobody pays much attention to them. And that sort of leads into one very, faux controversy of the last week. And I would say one of the sillier aspects of the sea change in journalism is the freak out about the Washington Post and the LA Times choosing not to endorse Kamala Harris. And what does that tell us about journalists, that so many supposedly objective reporters seem to think that their bosses must tell readers how to vote and consider it a disgrace if they don't?
It's really interesting that that's the reaction. And what's really funny is the LA Times came out and said that the reason that they didn't endorse Kamala is because they don't find her to be far left enough, particularly on the issue of Israel and Gaza. And that slowed down the criticism a bit, because it was suddenly like, oh, wait, we're not supposed to be offended at that. That's supposed to be okay. Washington Post.
Although they are offended about the fact that it's the daughter of the owner who is imposing it.
Right.
But they can't really,
They don't say very much about that. Because it's always the young person who doesn't have a lot of experience imposing this kind of insanity on corporations and institutions. That's really where a lot of this is coming from. But the Washington Post is different. Jeff Bezos is saying, nobody trusts us anymore. This is a way to rebuild trust. Now, will this rebuild trust? I don't know. But that is what he's claiming is his goal here. And of course, all the democracy defenders of the Washington Post, all the people who want to be taken seriously, don't like it one bit.
Yeah, I think, for Bezos, it's sort of his Michael Jordan moment. Michael Jordan famously said 30-odd years ago when he was asked, at the height of his fame and career as, a god of basketball, he was pressed to, over why he wasn't using his celebrity, as to endorse Democrats and, be political. And he famously said, Republicans buy sneakers too.
That's right.
And I think this is, Jeff Bezos Republicans use Amazon too. And can, and so it's, but that is, being interpreted by, pundits on the left as a preemptive surrender to fascism.
Right. Well, the funny thing is, it's like they don't believe him. And I don't know that I do either necessarily. I'm not sure that this is because he's worried about Amazon customers. I think that he thinks that Kamala Harris is going to lose. And he doesn't want to be on the endorsing a losing candidate side. That's really what makes sense to me here. I'm a poker player, so there's a lot of not only what hand you have and not only what hand they have, but what hand they think you have and what hand you think they have. So that's where I think we are with Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, I think there's probably a great deal of truth to that. And of course, as you just pointed out, the LA Times story is seemingly more complicated, although the public, the owner of the paper said his daughter was wrong. No, that's not the reason why we did it. Even though he had sort of, deputized her to sort of supervise the LA Times, which was a controversy in itself. Mm-hmm. But again, it's, I think it goes to this collective guilt that the liberal media had about 2016, where they felt that they were insufficiently partisan, which was nuts.
Yeah,
that they were
fully partisan.
They couldn't have been more
sufficiently partisan. Yeah,
but they were not full out. They still were at times pretending not to be full out propaganda and openly, biased. They were still pretending not to be biased, even as they were biased. And they don't want to be blamed, for the fact that half the country is still going to vote for Trump.
Right.
And, maybe, we don't know what's going to happen next Tuesday. It's very, it is very close in the 7, swing states. But right now, the momentum is all with Trump. He's come back from sort of the trough that he was in after Kamala Harris parachuted into the, into the race, with the coup against Biden, and they don't want to be blamed if he wins. So they're just, they're doing everything they can to appear partisan.
That's it. I think that they don't want the blame, but why would they be blamed if they're impartial, right? Why would anybody blame the very, very impartial, not at all partisan, not at all activist media if that's really what they are?
Yeah, which leads me to, I think, the next question, which is to drill down more on the fascism argument. Because, in fact, if Hitler were on the ballot, if there was an American Nazi party, which, some people on the left are pretending that the Republicans are more or less, that,
right,
then, it's like those counterfactual arguments, what if Hitler had been killed in 1933? What if? So, under that argument, anything is permissible, including, I might add, violence and assassination.
That's right. It's a very dangerous thing to say.
Many of us wrote about in July after, the attempt on Trump's life, the first attempt on Trump's life. Kamala Harris's closing argument for her presidential candidacy appears to largely center on the moment on the accusation that Trump is a fascist who will govern like an authoritarian and destroy democracy. Do you think it's working? And if not, why not? And for all of the responsibility that Trump may bear for coarsening public discourse in the last 9 years, do you think this attempt to delegitimize him and one of our two major parties and its voters will do long-term, damage to American democracy?
So I'm a superstitious person, and so I haven't been saying, "Oh, I think Trump is going to win," but
which he may not.
But I do think he is.
But yeah,
I think he is. Yet I don't. I don't push
you're
it.
not really saying it. Okay,
I'm saying it, but I'm not really saying it because superstition dictates that. But I think the fact that that is her closing argument makes me feel a lot better about his chances. Her closing argument is no longer joy. It's no longer turning the page. It's now this guy is a Nazi. And the thing is, he was already president for 4 years. So he didn't implement any of the authoritarian policies that she's claiming he will. In fact, he's kind of a moderate. I would say that my biggest problem with Donald Trump is that I'm a conservative and I'd like for him to be further to the right. And he's not. So the idea that he is going to be the second coming of Hitler and how just repulsive that is to say, and how beyond really any measure that's acceptable discourse, that's her closing argument. I think that makes me feel a lot better about Trump's chances.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, since anybody who was already considering voting for Trump is not likely to buy that. The only people who will buy that are the people who already thought that Trump was a Nazi. And maybe that shores up some of the, sort of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel vote, which, she may well be losing as that endorsement controversy at the LA Times shows. But, I think this is part of the way that Trump's Madison Square Garden rally was depicted both by Democrats and their media cheering section. And I sort of have to add, I think it was really interesting, somebody with any sense of the history of New York or the history of Madison Square Garden knows that is the largest indoor venue in New York, America's largest city.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It has been used as a political rally spot by Republicans, Democrats. It was used by Zionists and Jews, long before the rally, the Nazi rally in 1939. It was used by, Ben Hecht and, Hillel Koch it was the focus of their campaign when they were rallying people to, for rescue of European Jewry during the World War II to pressure the Roosevelt administration to do something about the Jews. I always think of that and it's sort of like, but the Nazi rally is the only thing that ever happened there. Yeah. The Knicks, the Rangers, nothing else
the Billy
counts.
Joel concerts, it's, it all happens at MSG. I think they really didn't like that he went into New York City and had a big rally there, and they had to turn it into, look at this Nazi. Again, I think that discourse is so unacceptable, and the fact that there aren't any guardrails on the left to say, don't do this, don't talk like this is beyond the pale. I think those guardrails really do exist on the right. When somebody on the right goes too far, you immediately see a chorus of people condemning them on the right. You almost never see it on the left. You almost never see that kind of thing on the left where they say this is not an acceptable way to speak about one of the two major party candidates who, again, has already been president. So largely what he's going to do and what he'll be like.
Yeah, that's the thing. I find it hard to believe that liberal pundits, whether it's Joe Scarborough in the morning or, Joe Scarborough who wakes them up in the morning on MSNBC to Rachel Maddow who tucks them into bed at night, do they really believe when they predict they'll be rounded up if Trump wins? After all, nobody stopped them from ranting against Trump for 4 years when he was president and doing their best to promote the Russia collusion hoax in his first term,
And Trump was very good for their business.
Oh, he was great. I mean, yeah, he was. And another 4 years of Trump will make them even richer, I would imagine, as everybody tunes in to see if, the jackboots will be arriving to drag off Joe and Mika.
Right.
And it's sort of when Trump was president, I mean, there weren't the sort of politically charged prosecution that Trump has endured under Biden's administration.
That's exactly it. That's really where I think the Trump campaign needs to draw the distinction. And in the meantime, I think it's kind of funny to say, oh, they're going to round up the journalists. Like, stop. I'm already voting for Trump. It's okay to turn their hysteria into a joke. And I think the Trump campaign should do that and also say, look, I'm being politically persecuted and you're accusing me of this, but look what's happened in the last 4 years.
Yeah, I think it's so blatantly obvious considering the collusion between, Silicon Valley oligarchs and the Biden administration to censor dissenting views about COVID and other things. As we learned with the Twitter files, the behavior of Attorney General Merrick Garland towards parents protesting against school boards enacting, woke ideology. Who's the authoritarian?
Right. It's also, to put a real fine point on it, but to call this a Hitler rally, a Nazi rally, Jews were able to be openly Jewish at the Donald Trump Madison Square Garden rally, where they had to be kept kind of behind closed doors at the DNC. They weren't laying tefillin in the crowd at the DNC. There weren't Israeli flags being waved at the DNC. And that's happening on the Republican side openly and proudly. The speakers are not only pro-Israel, but pro-Jewish, defending the rights of Jewish students in America, defending the rights of Jewish people in America to be safe, to be free. All of that is particularly noxious when you call it a Hitler rally.
Yeah. Now, one of the biggest stories about this election, and, again, once it's over, we'll be able to drill down and see how true it is about the gender gap for both men and women. Democrats seem to have a large edge among women, especially college-educated white women. And Republicans Trump is doing very well with men. Much better than even in the past, including because, Black and Hispanic voters who are male are tending to trend towards him now, too. That seems to speak, for the general tone of the campaign right now. And Michelle Obama was lecturing, men that if they're inclined to vote for Trump, it's because they don't value the lives of the women in their life, their life, which is, much like her husband was lecturing Black men that they had to vote for the Democrats or, they were bad. I guess, but it prompts me to ask, why are we polarized, not just about Trump, but by gender? It's sort of, how is this worked out that, it's turned into this Mars and Venus election in this way? Is it just abortion or is it something more?
I think it's probably mostly abortion. Of course, having said that, Donald Trump did lose women in the last 2 elections he had. But of course, Biden and before him, Hillary Clinton lost men. And it's not considered like, oh, they're so not doing well with men. It's a big problem. Biden lost by a smaller amount than Hillary Clinton did. But Democrats haven't won the male vote in decades. So it's quite an issue for them. I think we will see more women moving to Trump this time than in 2020, despite the abortion issue. There's other issues on the table, like inflation, like the border, crime, that are still important to women.
Kitchen table issues,
Yes, but it's hard to overstate how much women are told from a very, very young age that abortion is number one, all-encompassing issue and how important that is to them particularly. I remember getting this fed to me as a sophomore in high school, and I don't even think I was entirely clear on what abortion was. But the idea that abortion was something that women needed to protect at all costs is really, again, fed to women very early on, and I think it carries throughout their lives. Now, a lot of women are able to shake this off and focus on other things that matter to them, but there is this pressure of, how dare you not be for abortion? And it's I can't think of a similar equation for men. I don't think that there's one issue that men are told, how dare you not care about this one issue? I think it's, for men, they get to be kind of more a bunch of different things matter, and a bunch of different things are what they vote on. So it's an interesting kind of separation between the two genders, where the women vote center on this one thing, and that's what they're supposed to do, and men don't seem to have that.
Yeah, in spite of the fact that most Americans, if you drill down and you ask them what they're actually for and actually against, most Americans are in what I would call the mushy middle on abortion. They don't want it completely banned, which is actually where Trump is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Trump is not a
diehard, pro-life person. He never was. He's more of a pro-choice person, using the terminology of the other side. But they are in favor of restrictions, which Democrats are not. But that's, that gets lost in the effort to turn this into sort of a black and white issue.
Well, purposefully lost, right? There's a reason that the Democrats keep tying Project 2025 to Donald Trump, which has nothing to do with him. It's meant to kind of obscure what he really believes, because he is a very, very moderate guy, and they can't have that. They can't have that be the candidate that they oppose and call Hitler.
Yeah, well, I think they are missing like the big, what historians will say about this election and even the last two, which is the political realignment of this country, as the two parties have changed enormously.
Yeah.
The Republicans clearly are now much more the party of the working class, which is what Trump represents, and not a purely conservative party. The Democrats are the party of the credentialed elites and, a very left and the very poor, a very left-wing party. Wall Street backs the Democrats now, not the Republicans.
Right. And that's been coming. I mean, they've been moving in that direction for a while. But yeah, that's been a real shift in the last two election cycles, where, they're not voting for the billionaire. They're voting for the party apparatchiks who they think will be better for their business.
Exactly. And the Democrats are better for their business in no small measure because they're basically enabling, mass illegal immigration, which, is good for business. If you own a large corporation and you want cheap labor and to depress the wages of working class Americans, and, if you want the freedom to outsource their jobs, I think many conservative Republicans were slow to realize the danger that this posed to this country, because so many conservatives were sort of, more libertarian, Lockean liberals, if you were, and never really thought about, if they were actually conservatives, what are they seeking to conserve, and preserving communities and the livelihoods of ordinary Americans, even if they didn't go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Columbia, is actually something that conservatives and Republicans need to care about.
Absolutely. I would also say, going back to our first, the first question, the media enforced that you weren't allowed to talk about the problem of illegal immigration. I mean, it's not that this is not a new topic. When I got started in this business, writing a blog in 2001, and I wrote about illegal immigration all the time. It was a giant problem even then, but when you talked about it, you were shut down with being called a racist, and you kind of had to have a tough skin for it. It wasn't something that was as acceptable to say as it is now, where it's become standard, even among Democrats, to say we have to stop this border problem has gotten really out of hand. But it's been growing and heading in this direction for a long time. The numbers just kept increasing and increasing. In the last 4 years, of course, they've really exploded. But it's the fact that you weren't allowed to say this is a problem and not be called, a vicious racist. And I got away with a lot of saying what I really thought because I'm an immigrant. And I would say, well, I'm an immigrant. I came to this country following this very specific process, and this is how it used to work. And I was a refugee, and so I understand the refugee process. But this is not what's happening now. And there's nothing racist about saying that we need to go back to having a system the way that we did when I came here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Now, one of the big differences between the candidates is their attitude towards Israel. But this is a particular dilemma for Kamala Harris, who struggles to depict herself as a friend of Israel, while also praising and validating pro-Hamas anti-Semitic protesters, while also being damned as being insufficiently anti-Israel to satisfy her party's left-wing base.
Tough.
So
yeah.
I guess the question is, has she failed to thread the needle in such a way, and so that she's getting the worst of both worlds on this issue?
Yes, I think that she has failed to thread that needle. I think that she's not seen as pro-Israel and she's not seen as pro-Palestinian. She's seen as somebody who will say whatever it takes in front of the crowd that she's in front of. There was this conservative group, I forgot their name, but they were running ads in Michigan with Kamala Harris's pro-Israel comments. And this was seen as somehow anti-Semitic, to highlight that she has sent her husband out to be the Jewish convoy and envoy, not
deeply ironic.
Yes. And the fact is that she doesn't want them to find out what she said about Israel, and that she talks about being pro-Israel and giving them everything that they need. And then on the flip side of that, of course, she keeps saying that the protesters have a point. And if they have a point, those protesters who are saying globalize the Intifada and celebrating October 7th, then I think Jews need to understand that this is not their candidate either.
Yeah, I think, many on the right, many Republicans, especially Jewish Republicans, assume the worst about Kamala Harris because her roots are on the left. They assume that, her validation of, anti-Semitic pro-Hamas protesters is the real tell. The people on the left say, no. When you say you believe in the right of Israel to defend itself, even though she pretty much opposes every aspect of Israeli self-defense when it's implemented, that's the real tell. And I think, and I used to be more on the former, and now I just think she's a weather vane. She will, if she is elected, she will put her finger up in the wind. It would all be situational ethics, and it will depend. She will be very much anti the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu because Democrats despise Netanyahu. But she also knows that being anti-Israel is actually, bad politics. There are far more pro-Israel votes in the center, even among Democrats, to be lost than on the far left for people who think she's insufficiently anti-Zionist.
Right.
And I think she is, as much as everybody says she's, everybody on the right assumes she's an idiot, she's smart enough to know that. So I don't think we can possibly know what she's going to do. But of course, that's not exactly, if you really are a friend of Israel, that kind of uncertainty isn't what you want. Trump, for all of his flaws, and he can be very erratic, he's got a record, so we know.
We know. With Donald Trump, we know he's a supporter of Israel. We know he's a friend to Israel. It's funny because you sound pretty pessimistic, and you're still much more optimistic than I am about what a Kamala Harris presidency would look like for Israel. I think she is very far on the left. I think she's had to subdue that in order to run in this general election. And I think that her instincts are still to lean left and to embrace
She's a product of the
leftists.
California Democratic Party.
Exactly.
Sure.
Right. She's not a moderate. She's not somebody that really just, has sort of a centrist way about her. She is a leftist. And so I think that should she be elected, Israel is in for a world of pain. They're going to have weapons withheld. They're going to be scrutinized in a way that they're simply not going to be with Donald Trump. She supports Israel's right to defend itself in theory, but not in practice. When defending itself in practice, she's constantly criticizing their method. She's constantly backing down from the way that it has to be done. And she's holding back weapons right now with the Biden administration. And that's with Joe Biden, who is more moderate than she is, with holding the reins.
Yes, the slow walking of weapons is a story that continues to be underreported.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. And yes, you're right. Even under Biden, although it's hard to say who's actually running the country right now, but we'll just, for the sake of argument, assume that somehow Biden is involved in that. But, listen, I'm always very wary. I've been in this business long enough about making predictions. People are unpredictable. Sometimes they'll go against their backgrounds but Kamala Harris is just a political, creature. She has done everything that she could to climb, what 19th century pundits used to call the greasy pole.
Yeah.
And I do mean everything.
Mm-hmm.
There is no other, there's kind of no there. Yes, all her instincts are very liberal, leftist, but, I think she will toss anything to the wind. She's deeply cynical. If there's anything that I believe that Doug Emhoff, her husband, has ever said, it's when he says, well, Kamala, encouraged me to be interested in my Jewish roots and Israel. I think that's probably true because she thought it would be good for her, for her ambitions.
Right. What's the point of being married to you if you're not representing the group?
Right. And of course, he had no interest in being Jewish or anything to do with Israel or Zionism or Jewish identity or practice. And, it's very paper thin. It's very obvious. But I think she's a deeply, I've come to the opinion that she's just this deeply, deeply cynical individual who is just, in the end, just, a political partisan, if it means accusing Brett Kavanaugh of being a gang rapist,
right?
She'll say it.
She'll say anything.
If she thinks that's good for her, her political interests. If she thinks, showing some sympathy for Israel and the Jews will help her, she'll go a little bit in that direction. That's, in the end, people are, they are who, they are their profession, and, she's not a politician by accident. Let me put it that way. Of course, I don't think she would be good for Israel. I think she'd be, as I already said and have written many, many times, obviously it would be bad. But I'm, to me, cynicism is at her very core.
Yeah. You might be right that it won't. I mean, yes, she'll be bad for Israel, but she might moderate just because she is a political animal. And Israel remains very popular among Americans. Americans love Israel. Americans support Israel in large numbers. The insanity that we see on our streets and in college campuses, extreme minority, a very loud minority, but nevertheless, Americans are very pro-Israel.
Yeah, I think that is something that many in the pro-Israel community forget. Mm-hmm. And partly they forget it because they tend to be isolated in blue enclaves where most Jews live. Outside of Florida, which is becoming
you all should move down here.
Right. Outside of Florida, which has become really in many ways sort of, the locus of Jewish activism in our day. But, they see the non-Jewish world as essentially hostile. I mean, even though they're sort of 21st century Americans, they're still living in the shtetl. And they don't understand that the engine of pro-Israel activism in this country really isn't them. It's evangelical Christians.
That's right.
And, they don't get it. And that's part of the problem. And certainly the major Jewish organizations don't get it.
Don't get it at all.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that a little later.
Okay.
Now, one of the big issues that the liberal media is also ignoring is that of censorship. Mm-hmm. Now, and they seem to be acting in I would say the liberal Jewish groups are very much part of this, and indeed were very much part of its implementation in the last 4 years. The idea that censorship of dissenting views, or even hateful ones, is necessary to defend democracy. And, is it possible to imagine a leftist-dominated federal government, and the next Harris administration would be much farther to the left in terms of the people in decision-making positions, and not even talking about the sort of the administrative state, and seeking to take down free speech on X or on podcasts, as some have threatened. They see the fact that people, as you said before, listen to podcasts. They listen to all sorts of podcasts.
Can't have that. Yeah.
And, the question is, will we, the one thing, that among the many things that I'm worried about is, if Harris prevails, will we see more cooperation between Silicon Valley and social media platforms other than X and the government?
Mm-hmm. I think absolutely. I think that we're heading into a time where they have decided and they are projecting that free speech should not be free. And we're seeing this happen, of course, in Britain in a lot of ways. I think their free speech is they don't have the First Amendment, so I don't know how much free speech they had to begin with. But they were once considered a country where you could say what you want, and now I think largely that's just not true anymore. It's harder to accomplish in America, again, because of the First Amendment, but I certainly think they're going to try. Elon Musk supporting Donald Trump and owning X is something they just cannot abide. The billionaires have to belong to them. They're not allowed to go vote for other candidates and
like the African American community.
Stage.
Yeah,
well, that's it, right?
They have to stay on. They have to stay on the plantation.
Yep. That's exactly right. And so I think that we will see them targeting free speech in a lot of different ways. They're absolutely going to be coming for Elon if Kamala is elected.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much a certainty. Now, I believe one of the issues that isn't being sufficiently addressed in this campaign is DEI and woke ideology and the way that the government, the role it plays in promoting it. But part of that is also how these toxic ideas are affecting our children. You wrote a book with our, mutual friend Bethany Mandel, Stolen Youth, which we discussed on this podcast about this issue. It's now a year and a half after it came out. Where do you see that debate going now? Are you encouraged or discouraged?
I'm mixed because I am encouraged in some places. Living in Florida makes me a lot more optimistic in a lot of ways, and not just because it's sunny all the time. We have good policies here, and the fact that Governor DeSantis was able to head off a lot of the DEI that was going on in schools is huge. A lot of the woke education that was going on in schools, very big. So I'm optimistic in that way. Pessimistic in that I think that places like New York, where I am from, where I grew up, and which I love so much and would love to see it turn itself around, if Donald Trump wins, New York and places like it, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, all the deep blue areas, they're going to double down on this kind of stuff. They're going to see it as a rejection of Trumpism, and they're going to say, well, we're going to go harder on it. Because that's what happened in 2016. In 2016, Donald Trump gets elected, and a few weeks later, public schools in Brooklyn have the kids march against hate. And they don't say we're marching against Donald Trump, but it was obvious what the point was. And then shortly thereafter, they had another march against climate change. And they realized we're turning these kids into little activists. We're pushing our ideology on them. And that is a way of rebelling against Donald Trump. They're becoming the resistance, these kids. And how are you going to argue with kids? That's what Bethany and I talk a lot about in the book, is that they turn these kids into child soldiers, because how can you argue with a 15-year-old pigtailed girl from Sweden who's afraid that the world's going to end? You largely can't. And it's all one thing. It's not like, I think what Greta Thunberg has really shown us is you can easily move from one leftist issue, fighting climate change, to another leftist issue, fighting Israel, and not skip a beat. And that's by design. They're designing these kids to be activists for all leftist causes. So if you think like, oh, my kid's school, well, they march against climate change, and I don't mind that because I also think we should do something about climate change. Understand, you're not just signing up for that one thing. You're signing up for a whole host of things.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And when you speak of the resistance, that leads me to my next question, in which I'm going to invite you to speculate.
I love speculating.
Not necessarily to prognosticate, but what do you expect will happen if, as the polls seem to indicate, is a growing possibility, Donald Trump is elected president again? Will the left challenge the results and foment riots reminiscent of the BLM summer of 2020? Will there be an effort to stop the Electoral College votes from being cast and counted? Or will they, as they said Republicans should have done 4 years ago, and in contrast to their own behavior after 2016, simply respect the results and dutifully take up the role of a loyal opposition?
Well, it won't be that last one.
No.
There will almost certainly be riots if Donald Trump wins. Banks in New York are already going remote for election week. I hear it from other businesses, law firms, that are not having people come to the office because they're concerned about rioting. They're concerned about violence. And I think that's an extremely likely scenario. will they accept the results? Did Hillary Clinton ever accept the results? She did concede, so there's that. But she spent 4 years saying that Donald Trump was an illegitimate president, and that was acceptable for her to say on places like CNN and on The View and other shows like it. She was allowed to just say that he had somehow stolen the election from her and that there was Russian collusion, and all of that became something acceptable to say, even though it was so, evidence-free, obviously, but also just a crazy thing to say that Donald Trump is some Russian spy, and that's why Hillary Clinton, a really disliked candidate, lost the election. So will they accept it? Partially, but not really. And will it matter? I really do believe in our institutions. I believe in our processes. I think that it's going to be okay. But
I think most
they will
Americans,
put on a show.
Contrary to a movie that came out in the last year called Civil War, I think most Americans, including people who vote Democratic, have no interest in civil war. They don't want to be at war with their neighbors. That's why I think you're right when you say that Kamala Harris framing the election as, it's a vote, about fascism and Hitler doesn't really resonate, except with the core Democratic base that just hates Trump. I don't think most Americans want any part of that. I think, the fact that I think any businessman who doesn't board up his windows if he has, a storefront in a city or even a suburb, I was advising my barber to do the same, after the election tells you everything about, where we are as a country. And I don't think most Americans, like that. They didn't like, the Capitol riot.
Of course.
Whatever you think about, how the election went or what was unfair or
absolutely,
they rightly, were appalled by, people breaking into the Capitol and getting into fights with cops. Yeah, so was I, and,
wrote
about it. But sort of the Democrat overreaction in which they attempted to depict it as the equivalent of firing on Fort Sumter and, this vast conspiracy, encompassing pretty much the entire Republican Party to overthrow democracy, in Liz Cheney and, Nancy Pelosi's vision. I don't think that really helped them.
I agree. I was appalled on January 6th, but the insane overreaction where so many Americans believe that the people the protesters on January 6th were armed, and they weren't, and that is
they killed policemen.
Oh, that they killed policemen. That people were murdered that day. All of that is
when in fact the only
crazy
person who actually was shot dead was one of the protesters, and whatever you may say about the illegal behavior of the protesters, had that Capitol policeman shot a Black Lives Matter protester
or
in that
burglar
manner,
or anything,
they would be already serving a life sentence for murder.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Instead of getting off scot-free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, recently you wrote a column talking about what you called your beef with American Jews. What did you mean by that? And how do you evaluate the performance not just of the leading organizations in the year since the October 7th massacres and the accompanying surge in anti-Semitism, but, the bulk of American Jewry? How do you think we did in the last year?
Trying to get me in trouble here, Jonathan.
Well, you're no more trouble than I'm in every week, so don't, you're in good
October 7th was a turning point for a lot of people. I've seen a lot of people wake up and say, wait a minute, I'm on the left and this is no longer acceptable to me. And I've thought about for myself, what if I woke up on October 7th and it was conservatives joyfully celebrating the attacks in Times Square? What would I rethink? And I can tell you that I would rethink everything. It wouldn't be like, oh, okay, I only oppose this party, I only oppose this movement on this one thing. I would have to rethink everything. And I think a lot of liberal Jews have been doing that over the last year. But the organizations and a lot of the people kind of in leadership roles are so far behind on it that they're incapable. They're tied to the Democratic Party and they don't know how to untie themselves. So one of the things I wrote it was a Substack, it was a rant about how I'm worried that not enough American Jews will wake up and it puts all of us in danger. But one of the things I pointed out was, there's all these galas and parties and celebrations that Jewish organizations have, and they give awards all the time. And
well, they're raising money.
They're raising money, but they're also thanking the people who support them, right? And they have not had any of the big conservative people on their stages. No, these people have been wall-to-wall supportive of not only Israel, but of American Jews. Megyn Kelly, Dan Bongino, Buck Sexton, Clay Travis. I had a long, long list, and I still forgot people on it. Hugh Hewitt, I didn't put on that list, which I feel bad about. Be on there, yeah. Yeah, but forget about even like the media people. Elon Musk goes to Israel, wears the dog tags. Where is his thank you? Any other billionaire would be just the belle of every ball.
Yeah, they'd
be celebrated
all
everywhere. All over. He would have to be turning down invitations from Jewish organizations because he just couldn't do them all. And he has not gotten a thank you. None of those media people got a thank you. Donald Trump does not get a thank you. And it's really not acceptable to me, because if it were Democrats that were behaving this way, other than, one Fetterman from Pennsylvania.
Well, he's an interesting exception, but he is an exception.
But he's the great example for me, because I'm able to, as a conservative, say, wow, Fetterman's amazing. He's doing incredible stuff on Israel. His words for Jews in America are unbelievable. And if I had a Jewish organization, believe me, I'd thank Fetterman. But they don't do that. They don't have that same thing. In fact, I was thrown out of Mothers Against Anti-Semitism group because I wrote about their internal strife of realizing that, like, Ron DeSantis is on their side. He's protecting Jewish students who go to colleges in Florida. He's not only standing with Israel. That has to be just one part of it. He's standing for Jews in America. He's standing for Jewish students in Florida. How could you not say thank you to a man like that? And they don't, because they see themselves as Democrats first. There was a story, this will air in a few days, but Ryan Gerdusky on CNN made a joke at Mehdi Hassan. They got into it on a CNN panel. Mehdi Hassan called Trump supporters Nazis, and then he said, well, you called me anti-Semitic. And Ryan said, oh, I've never called you anti-Semitic. And he said, well, everybody called me anti-Semitic. When you're Palestinian, that's, what's expected of you. And Ryan said, I hope your beeper doesn't explode. And, whatever you think of that, I thought it was funny. But the ADL...
Yeah, actually, I think the proper response would be to argue that you actually are anti-Semitic.
Right. And he is. But that's, neither here nor there. ADL immediately went after Ryan Gerdusky. It's disgusting. How dare you, talk like this? Jonathan Greenblatt tweeting about it. And then the next day, he said, well, now that I've watched the exchange, Mehdi Hassan, minimizing, calling people Nazis and all that. Well, how about you watch the exchange first before you go and criticize Ryan Gerdusky for this? And it's appalling to me that Jewish organizations are so just in love with the political side that could not possibly care less about them.
Yeah, well, I think, what it comes down to is that many liberal Jews have no trouble with the claim that Trump is a Nazi, including some, not just, ordinary Democratic partisans, but, people like, Deborah Lipstadt, or his, historian, now the anti-Semitism ambassador in the State Department, and Abe Foxman, the former head of ADL, who was a lot better, than Jonathan Greenblatt.
But now he's off a cliff
But now
again.
He's all in on these sort of partisan things. But draw no conclusions from the fact that we are having a Charlottesville-style anti-Semitic rally virtually. We've had one virtually every day from Hamas supporters since October 7th. And I guess, the question I keep asking and sort of answering is, why can't they understand the threat and the nature of it?
They don't. The other thing that I like to point out is that these Charlottesville events are not happening everywhere. I think that in October 2023, there was a lot of like, oh my God, anti-Semitism's everywhere. And I just kept saying, like, it's really not everywhere. It's not happening in red areas in nearly the same amounts as it's happening in blue areas. And then the argument goes, well, it's because Jews live in blue areas and that's why they're being attacked there. No, even in places that have very few Jews, and I compared, I believe it was Vermont and Mississippi, or New Hampshire and Mississippi, something like that. They both have under 1% of Jews, but the blue state has way higher incidence of anti-Jewish hate, anti-Jewish graffiti, anti-Jewish attacks. Number one place for attacks of Jews, Brooklyn, New York, physical attacks. So you have this situation where they want to believe, oh, America is anti-Semitic. Well, that's not true. America is absolutely not anti-Semitic. I think they need to really be clear on the fact that this is coming from your own political side. If you're a liberal Jew, you need to look around and see who's standing with you, and you'll find not that many people on your side are.
Yeah, very true. Now, while I certainly agree, and I've written many times, that most of the really dangerous anti-Semitism, not all of the really dangerous anti-Semitism, is coming from the left, it's also true that it exists on the right. How do you evaluate the threat from people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, a more extreme and crazier version, and whether someone like Tucker, who certainly his statements after October 7th were deplorable, never mind his Holocaust denial show, will influence a second Trump administration?
So it's interesting, right? First of all, I think Tucker and Candace are two very different situations. Candace is a crazy person. Like, I genuinely don't, I don't think that she's very intelligent. I don't think that she says other things that are like, oh, well, on this I agree with her, but on this I don't. Whereas Tucker is able to parse it in a way that I think a lot of people who are supportive of Jews and of Israel will still listen to him. He's able to almost dance around the topic. But what I say to people on both Tucker and Candace, and even any of the even more fringier people on the right, those people are all going to be voting for the most pro-Israel president that America's ever had. So I think that it's a threat for sure. I am very cognizant of the fact that there's a growing sentiment on the right that they shouldn't be as pro-Israel as they are, and that perhaps, Jews are a problem and all of that. But again, Donald Trump is a model pro-Israel president. Can't look at him as anything but that. Even when I'll be frank with you, this was the first time I voted for Donald Trump. I voted early in Florida, day one that I was able to do it, because I couldn't wait to vote for him after October 7th. I felt that he earned my vote in all the ways that he's pro-Jewish and pro-Israel, but also all the ways that I think that his pro-America policies reflect what I believe. I didn't vote at all in 2020. It was, I believe, drizzling in New York, and I had nothing else on my ballot. It didn't matter. And then in 2016, I did a silly write-in. But this time, I felt much more serious about it. This time, I wanted to reward him with my vote, and I hope that other Jews do the same. But I need people to understand that all these people that you're concerned about on the right are also going to be voting for the most pro-Israel president. And that's, not what's happening on the left. The leader on the left is not directing traffic for the base the way that Donald Trump is on the right.
Yeah, that's very true. Now, turning to Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is still widely reviled by a lot of American Jews and most Democrats, and is, of course, a controversial figure in his own country. Looking from afar, as an American Jew who cares about these issues, do you think we should be reevaluating Netanyahu in light of his ability to withstand American pressure and stick to a policy of seeking victory over Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran? Or is it too soon to know whether his post-October 7th leadership eclipses any responsibility for that disaster?
It's tough because I think that the Democrats and people who don't like Netanyahu in America think that if there was another leader, he'd be fighting a different kind of war in Gaza. And that's not true. That's just absolutely not true. There's no other leader who could get elected in Israel who would be fighting a kinder, gentler war in Gaza or in Lebanon or striking Iran or any of that. All of that has a ton of support in Israel. The stuff that Netanyahu is unpopular over in Israel is not security stuff. I mean, October 7th, obviously, a lot of people hold him accountable, but it's never, we don't like the way he's handling humanitarian aid in Gaza. That's absolutely not it. So I think American Jews misunderstand that if they swapped out Netanyahu tomorrow, it still wouldn't be, Tzipi or somebody on the left. It would be another person on the right who would fight a very, very similar war. I don't know. It's hard to gauge the internal Israeli politics from afar. I think that American Jews really don't know what goes on in Israel internally and what makes sense for them. Netanyahu keeps getting elected. They kept having elections. It kept being Netanyahu. There's a reason for that. And American Jews have to kind of accept that Israeli Jews know what's best for them. Now, flipping that argument around, American Jews will say, well, we vote for Democrats, and Israeli Jews should accept that we know what's best for us. Fine. I hope American Jews move to the right, but I understand the argument of American Jews do what's best for American Jews.
Yes, absolutely. In principle, that's true. The question is, are they actually defending their own
interests?
Right,
I don't think that
or
they're
defending
doing the
the
right
interests
thing,
of
but I
their
think that
partisan
they think they're
allies
doing the right thing. Right.
rather than their own. And that's sort of been a generational argument between liberal and conservative Jews.
Yeah.
Well, Karol, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. Our readers and viewers and listeners should follow her work on our Substack, Karol Markowicz at substack.com, and listen to her podcast, The Karol Markowicz Show, and Normally. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Next week, we'll be breaking down the election results live on Thursday, November 7th with the great Ruthie Blue. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.